So we've seen that there are two measures of center primarily that we use to describe a data set, the mean and the median. There's also the mode that is sometimes important, uh, but probably more often we're using the mean or the median. And the choice of a measure of spread, of how we talk about how the data is distributed and how we would visualize it, usually depends on which one of those we're using. If we're using the mean value to describe the measure of center, then typically we're looking at a histogram and thinking about things that way. And we'll do that a lot. But if we're using the median, then more often than not, we need a different measure of the spread in the distribution. We're thinking about that in a different way. The median is the middle point, so there's 50% above and 50% below. And so it naturally puts us in the direction of thinking about percentiles of data. And so more commonly, when you're dealing with the median or describing the center as the median, we're going to use this 5-number summary and divide the data into quartiles. And the measure of spread is then what we call the interquartile range, which is the middle 50% of data. So this IQR is the middle 50%. And we can visualize the 5-number summary in a box plot, or sometimes called a box and whisker plot. You've got the box in the middle and then the whiskers extending to the sides. And if you notice, there are 5 lines on the box plot. So we've got one box plot here, one box plot here. There are 5 vertical lines on this that indicate 5 points in the data. And what those points represent are the lowest value, which would be the 0 percentile, lower quartile, which is the 25th percentile, so 25% of the data is below that value, the median, 50%, upper quartile, 75%, highest value, 100%. So at the highest value, 100% of the data is below that point. And so we can identify, and let me blow this up a little bit so we can look at this more closely on the next slide. So we can identify where those points are on the graph. Now the data that we have here, and it could be anything, but this is the data for the waiting time of the 2 banks. Box plots often come into play when you're comparing variables. So if you, comparing groups on a particular variable. So in this case, the variable is the waiting time at the bank, and then we have 2 different banks to look at, and the box plot allows us to look at how the data is distributed for those 2 different banks. And so we have one bank here plotted on the bottom. It goes from 4.1 to 11.0 minutes of wait time. The middle 50% is between 5.6 and 8.5, and the median is 7.2. Now for the other bank, the data starts at 6.6 and goes up to 7.8. The middle 50%, or the IQR range, is from the IQ range, IQR, is from 6.7 to 7.7 with a median at 7.2. So these 2 banks have the same measure of center when you're using the median, but very different spread, right? This bank here has a very narrow spread. This has a large spread. And so you see the spread in the data and the distribution pretty quickly when you're looking at a box plot from the 5-number summary. And we easily see that this data has a much wider distribution. The interquartile range here for this one, just to see the calculation out, just take the upper quartile, subtract the lower quartile. 8.5 minus 5.6 gives me 2.9. If I did the same thing for the one on top, it would be 7.7 minus 6.7, so this has an IQR of 1. And so clearly, by the numbers, the top bank here has a much smaller distribution. So this gives us a way to look at data when it's divided into the 5-number summary. And it's like a version of a histogram. You can sort of visualize this as a histogram based on how the box plot and where the whiskers go. So if you're thinking about this, it's sort of like a one-dimensional almost look at the histogram. And the box is telling you where like the middle peak of the data is. And so you could visualize this as, okay, the histogram starts here and then it sort of builds up to a peak here in the middle and then it trails off to this side here. And And the same thing for here, but the graph starts here, it ramps up quickly, and then trails off here. So you can visualize these like histograms. They're essentially telling you the same information, but we use them when we have data divided into percentiles. Now, here are the instructions on how to create one of these box and whisker charts in Excel. It's fairly straightforward. You highlight the data, and then you go Insert, and then select the box and whisker plot from the statistical plot options. So we'll use those later on as needed, especially when we're comparing different groups. One thing to note here is when Excel makes them, let me go back a slide, it plots these vertically instead of horizontally. It's just a aesthetic difference, nothing material there. Excel just makes them vertical instead of horizontal.